Thank you. Good morning. It's really a pleasure to be here, and this is just so great to be able to be here the very first time that Accenture Europe has met as a single leadership team. I think that's, first of all, it's striking that that is the fact of the matter, but it's also pretty exciting, and I think it's great to have the opportunity to be able to speak to you in that context. I am part of a very small firm. My partner and I own a small team of people, work with a small team of people that work exclusively in this space. And the leadership thought it was useful for me to share a little bit about what we've discovered over the last several years working with our clients, some of whom are also your clients. I've actually had the opportunity to collaborate with a handful of Accenture people over the years working with various large multinational companies. And most of these insights were captured in a book that Amy Cates and I did a few years ago that really took a look at what companies were doing that had really embraced this idea of a different kind of matrix organization that was much more centered on a true collaborative outcome. So the slides that I'm going to share here were not prepared specifically for Accenture. We use these in presentations that we make in a lot of different public and inside company kinds of presentations. But I think you'll see that a lot of these themes really do apply to Accenture, and hopefully this will help to stimulate some dialogue later today, and especially in some breakout sessions that we will run tomorrow. So, of course, we're consultants like you. We have to have our explanation of what's going on in today's world, and we look at that largely through an organizational lens, since that is our business. And so what we discover as we've sort of worked through these themes that are happening broadly in the environment is that it really means seeking new operating models for nearly all of the companies that we work with. Some of those companies are trying to become more global. Others of those companies are trying to find ways to actually be more local, but they are all puzzling in some way through the nature of a matrix organization that they already have in search of something that is better aligned with today's environment, and particularly around this idea of being able to be global and local at the same time, being able to capture the benefits of both agility and scale, and especially looking for ways to get better at being more horizontal. And Amy and I have talked at a couple of conferences lately where there is this strange debate going on over when will hierarchy completely go away from the organizational models, and we are convinced that hierarchy will never go away, certainly not in organizations of this size, and that hierarchy plays an important role. But we still over-rely on hierarchy much too much in today's organizations. And what those who are really trying to create something different have discovered is we have to get better at this idea of working horizontally. And the mandate almost always starts externally. It starts with the customer. Because whether you are making air conditioners or tractors or heavy equipment or pharmaceuticals, or you are in the life sciences, or you are in finance and banking, customer solutions require horizontal capability inside the companies that serve them. This is especially obvious in companies that are now bundling hardware, software, services. Royal Dutch Philips, that has just completely reinvented itself to become a healthcare giant, is now changing its organizational model, de-emphasizing the P&Ls of the past, which were global products, in order to create much more of a geographic-centered solution delivery kind of P&L that can bundle hardware, software, and services in service to these very large healthcare providers that they serve today. In all of these, there is a central tension. That tension will play out in the room today, tomorrow, and it will certainly play out when you go back to the organization where you work. And it is a tension between two forces, very natural forces. One is the need to create a kind of flexibility and a kind of focus that smaller organizational units tend to be better at doing, and particularly when they are more local. And there are a great deal of benefits that come out of this. It makes you more responsive, it gets you closer to the customer, and arguably it creates clear accountabilities. That's why we break things up into divisions or segments, is to achieve this sort of accountability. But taken too far, that kind of organizational model tends to have some negatives. It tends to produce duplication, and it tends to not be very scalable at the enterprise level. And so there is this other outcome that we need that is really about bringing the aggregate together effectively. Think of that as the global model in the case of a global matrixed organization. And obviously this is about being able to take on fewer, bigger bets in the way that we bundle solutions for customers, but it's also about sustainable cost models. Things that become scalable tend to be more cost-effective as well, obviously. And so in every case, the problem to solve is this. The problem is, what is that right blend for us in this tension between the benefits of breaking things up, making them local, and seeking the aggregate outcome? And companies go down different paths for this. They try to break down the silos. Some are moving today toward a more local decision-making model, companies that have been very global for years. Philips is an example of that. PepsiCo, we were actually working with PepsiCo in 2013 to help them roll out their global category management organization, which was a radical change for this very decentralized company. But now, today, under a new CEO, they have done a quick turn and are headed the other direction because they are convinced that their markets really demand much more of a local presence, more local entrepreneurship and decision-making. So companies do tend to move back and forth often on this continuum, and they are often doing it in an effort to try to break down silos. But one of the things that we noted in our own research is that every time we break down one set of silos, we create another set. It's unavoidable. And so the central problem remains how to work horizontally across whichever set of those verticals that we create. The problem never goes away, right? But we can think about it differently. And the model here is an attempt to do that. What we've learned sort of the hard way is that the debate between whether or not we should be decentralized, agile at the local level, or centralized is part of the problem. It's the wrong debate. That it is not an issue of trying to somehow find the right compromise between central and decentral. That is too much of an either-or problem to solve. And instead, there is an and that idea would be to think more about center-led. And in order to understand that, you have to accept the idea that there really are two dimensions represented here. On the vertical axis, we have the idea of integration, tying things together. On the horizontal axis, what we're really talking about is control, which happens in a lot of different ways. Policies and practices and signature requirements and DOA and other attempts at sort of controlling operations. And in fact, when we talk to executives in different companies, when we're doing our discovery work, it's a very common theme to hear the executives that are out running the businesses out in the organization tend to perceive their company as too centralized. It's almost universal. But when you talk to the people that sit in the corporate center, that run the corporate functions, they give you the opposite explanation. No, we're way too centralized. Those people out there are running separately from each other. And the fact is, both are correct. Because what's often happening in those environments is that they're playing in this space down here, where they actually are very low on integration. Countries each kind of creating their own products. We're working with the Otis elevator piece of United Technologies. Now they think of themselves as a French company in France because they built the elevator on the Eiffel Tower. It's a pretty cool thing to say, right? But in Otis, and this is not a big secret, in Otis, every single part of the world creates its own elevator designs. Every one of them is different. They have almost no platforms of any kind. They have a few common electronic components, like the controls in the elevators here, where you push the button, it tells you which elevator to go to based on your floor, right? So they have the IoT thing harmonized, but all of the hardware and even most of the software development is very local. It's clearly not a sustainable model, right? So they are reinventing that. But they were a great example of a company that worked in this space. Very little integration, but the general managers feel completely tied up by controls and policies and signature requirements that come from the corporate center back in Connecticut. It's not a good model. It goes nowhere good. And the alternative is not to centralize. What we're arguing is that the alternative is to move to this idea of something that is center-led, which means we have common process, we have common strategy, we develop common platforms, we have a common understanding of customer requirements, even if they do vary, which they do. The high-rise boom in China is 60% of their market right now, and it does have very different requirements than those in Europe or in the US. But they can still harmonize a great deal of what they are trying to accomplish through this more center-led approach to running the business, which then allows them to empower teams out in the field. Once they agree on the agenda and they agree on those harmonized processes and platforms, they really can delegate authority for creating customer solutions into the regions, the clusters, the countries that are managing the P&Ls in that company. It is a different way of thinking. Nike is an example of a company that has really mastered this, where in about 8 years' time of working in this kind of organization, they have gone from allowing 80% of the product collection in Asia to be created completely locally, to now a formula where 80% of the product around the world is drawn from a global collection, because they are working horizontally so much more effectively across categories and across those major product engines that have to create the apparel, the footwear, and the equipment. It's a striking example of effectiveness of working in this more center-led model while delegating lots of responsibility and authority out to the regions and the clusters. So, puts us in a place where people can pull from the assets and the capabilities wherever they may sit in the world. So in Nike, they will scale a development center in a part of Asia or in a part of Latin America around global football to serve the global football consumer, which really is a global consumer. The work moves to where the capabilities and the capacity sits. The organization structures of these companies all look the same. You know this. We've got John Deere on the left, we've got PepsiCo on the right, but they're all the same. They're all made up of global functions, some kind of global offering, product, services, whatever the case may be. And then, of course, the channels, often the regions, which become the operating units of these global matrixed companies. They all look the same. What makes them different is one really big idea. And we discovered this in the research we did in writing the last book, which is the ones that make these things work are the companies who figure out how to activate those models. And I'll give you a hint. Activation is a big word that is really nothing more than changing behavior. When they are activated, people live and work and behave differently. And it looks something like this when it works. Our best ideas move fast across the offerings, the brands, the channels, the geos. Product function and geo teams and processes are aligned around bigger ideas that can be taken to more markets. We take advantage of our scale in a way that still keeps important decisions close to customers. Global and local teams share the accountability in those nodes of the matrix. They co-own what the CEO at Philips calls the franchise. Frans van Houten, he's such an intuitive thinker about this stuff. He has really got people focused on this idea that wherever the geography and the global teams meet, that space is a franchise that he wants to delegate all kinds of responsibility to, and he wants his senior executives to back away from those nodes, support them, but don't control them. Let them run their businesses. And when it works, we have functions that add the right value at the right cost. From the center, but with capability that is built effectively out in the markets. When it doesn't work that way, what we've tended to see are these kinds of things. We have too many layers. Work is duplicated from layer to layer. I can't distinguish the unique value-added role of one layer versus another. This is especially true in leadership roles that tend to get stacked deeply. But it's also true of functions. How many clients do you work with who have 3 layers of marketing that are all trying to do something the same and yet differentiating the role of the global center versus the region versus the cluster versus the country? Sometimes it's 4 layers deep. It's very hard to do. And in a matrix, that's how you completely incapacitate the organization. A matrix with layers will bring the company to a stop. It's been demonstrated over and over again. Business units are aligned without changes to the broader system. Overlaying a global team into a regional organization for which there are no connector points. There are no docking stations in the nodes for them to work together. Power dynamics that remain unresolved. There are some executive leadership teams and some of our clients, they just don't want to deal with the power issue. And they keep hoping it will just go away, that people will just figure it out. And of course, really good teams do, but we can help them to do it a little more quickly and a little more effectively. Global functions are designed to do yesterday's work, often independent of the needs of the business. Leaders don't know how or are not motivated to work in the collaborative model. There are a number of studies that have been replicated a number of times that demonstrate that when these big organization changes fail, and your friends at McKinsey argue they fail 75% of the time based on their research, it is often because of what the Center for Creative Leadership refers to as legacy leaders in substantially new roles. Not taking the time to select the right players for those nodal positions and not taking the time or making the investment in showing them how. Developing leaders who can work in these environments effectively. and motivating them with the right kinds of incentives and metrics, which is something that your leadership has spent a lot of time on the last several weeks, and I'm so enthusiastic about the direction that's taken. We'll see that later. And lastly, and this sort of becomes a sort of a microcosm of the disease, is an executive committee that is a committee of individuals, each with their own P&L or their own function, who really spend most of their time in that silo and do not understand or are not willing to play an enterprise leadership role. A big fail, a big miss. So in the book, as we put this together, we came up with a simple idea for trying to summarize what was it that these companies that succeeded did most effectively to activate these complex organizational models. And it boiled down to three broad themes, and we tried to use some common parlance in order to characterize those. The first we called the right connections, which is really about how to make sure that the layers are flat enough and that we've identified those connectors in the nodes where the vertical and the horizontal work together, that we've actually designed in the right, we call them docking stations, for that collaboration, for what Van Houten at Philips describes as the business handshake. And we are creative about formalizing networks, understanding that the organization chart itself will never show you these connections. It's what's happening behind that org chart that we have to figure out. Your industry groups are a really good example of where it will require a creative form of very formalized network to create that industry thread across all the boundaries that make up the new organization. It will not show up on any organization chart. It can't. The organization charts are too limited. So those are some of the kinds of things we need to wire in around the right connections. The second one we call the right conversations. And this is a very behavioral thing. This is really a kind of metaphor for making the human connections necessary to make these things work. And it includes the way that the players in the nodes, in the franchise, create a strategy, the way they come to understand customers, clients, the common data sources that they utilize, the way they align their objectives, and the way they manage the performance of the business across time are all part of these conversations. And it includes the way that they make decisions inside each of the franchises, which we're going to talk about a lot tomorrow in a very active exercise. So these conversations are really a critical part of getting these connectors to come to life, to activate. And then lastly, it is about having the right leaders who demonstrate the right behaviors. There's a lot of research that's been done by a number of groups now on what this new cross-boundary leader looks like. We've learned a lot about that over the last 10 or 15 years. It is a little different breed of cat. People that are much more comfortable with uncertainty. We'll talk about that in a minute. And there are a set of practices that go with these. We shared these with the core team here at Accenture early on in the design process, and they have creatively taken some of those pieces and have begun to weave them into some of the design thinking, and I'm certain there will be more of that over time. And it's all about designing them in at those connection points, within those nodes, where the vertical and the horizontal meet. In your case, it is a more complex problem to solve because you have a lot of connection points that have to be wired together. The set of capabilities that you have built over the last decade or more, it's impressive by any standard. And it means a more complex organizational problem to solve in wiring together those horizontal linkages. In every case, a lot of that is accomplished through this idea of the right connections, the right conversations. But let's take a minute on the leadership problem. How many of you have perhaps read one of C.K. Prahalad's book over the years? Writer on strategy. He's sort of a very big thinker. He's actually no longer with us, but just a terrific thinker on organization, on strategy. And C.K. had a very interesting way of thinking about leadership in these models. And I'll tell you right now, there is a bit of a paradox in the thinking, but I'm going to take the time to read it to you. C.K.'s argument was that in the complex global matrix, leaders must learn to cope with decreasing degrees of strategic freedom while assuming accountability and more freedom to act. Let that sort of settle in for a second. A bit of a paradox. We have microphones at the table, right? Anybody care to estimate what CK is trying to convey here? What the thought behind this is? Or maybe elaborate on it a bit? I still have 11 minutes, so I'm not in a hurry. Any thoughts about this statement, please? Is there a microphone there on the table?
Do I just speak?
If you can, maybe you could stand up and shout if there's no microphone there.
Well, I think it's the crux of your center-led approach, which is you put the boundary conditions above and then give the freedom to operate locally.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a really good way to think about it. It is sort of the problem, and it's also sort of the good news of accepting that there is this shared agenda. There is a box, there is a frame, and we will play inside that frame. And what he's saying is, inside that frame, we're going to play very hard. It's a bit like, do the children play in a sandbox? You know what a sandbox is, right? Yeah. It's a bit like that. The frame of the sandbox is very clear, but we are going to play very hard inside that sandbox, and we're going to push on its boundaries. So it is a recognition that when I'm in that collaborative model, I have a partner. Maybe I'm working in the geo, but I have a partner that's working with a global agenda, and I have to identify with both of those responsibilities. I have to bring those two together. So I don't have absolute strategic freedom. But we don't have time to sit and wait either. We have to have teams that are empowered, that can move quickly inside that frame. And to accept the fact that we have accountability, whether or not we have all the authority or not, because you know what? No one does anymore. So this idea of accepting accountability without necessarily having all of the authority we would like is another part of the theme that CK is trying to get across. So I would argue that that paradox really is the challenge. It is the leadership problem to solve, working inside these collaborative organizational models. It is a big part of how we activate those models. The last thought that I would share is the idea that activation is something that is not a separate, or it's not something that happens after the design work. It's something that's actually going on while the organization design work is happening. And your team did that. That was a part of the small contribution that our team, I think, brought to the puzzle, was this idea of thinking while we're doing the design work. How will we activate this? And then the other idea is recognizing that we could call that March 1. This work doesn't end March 1. In some ways, the hardest part begins. Most of our clients that have worked at this kind of system level have discovered that it's a 2 or 3 year process to complete that activation. So, to summarize, and then let's take a few questions because we have a few minutes. Operating models define how we're going to run the company. and they are much more than structure. Horizontal ways of working are the point because the customer demands it. The core tension in the matrix is finding that balance or that sweet spot between local and agile and scalable, integrated, global. Center-led means empowering teams that are aligned around shared strategies, working inside a frame. Activation really is the objective, and it's accomplished through this idea of right connections, right conversations, right leaders. And the big organizational announcement of yesterday was not the finish line. Really, it's the starting line. And with that, are there a few questions we could take on? Why not? You should probably introduce yourself.
So I was interested in the skills. So I get the behavioral side, I get the structural side. The integration is the skill as well as something you can direct people towards. What is your, from an activation perspective, what do you think the critical time is of building the skills?
Yeah, it's a fabulous question. And a complex one. Some of it is actually hardwiring. A lot of the research says that there really are hardwired characteristics in leaders that you can measure that have to do with this willingness to demonstrate what some have called learning agility, which is largely about being curious, about not requiring a lot of structure. You know, I don't need a racy chart. Coca-Cola would throw young, high-potential leaders in years past, they would throw them into jobs like running the bottling company in Nigeria. Some of their highest potential leaders came through those kinds of assignments because they had to figure out, you know, many of them back in the day, they had to actually barter for glass. They would get vodka from Russia and they would barter for glass locally and then had to figure out how to get it from point A to the bottling plant without breaking all of it. Those are sort of measures of this kind of hardwired curiosity, ability to manage complexity. Skill-wise, it's really largely about influence-based leadership, the ability to create a shared agenda, the ability to paint pictures that become a compelling vision for a team. When we see this happening in extraordinary companies, these are leaders who they don't even want to look at an organization chart. They have a notion of a community of interest that extends around the world, and they behave as though they are the leader of that virtual team of people, regardless of what's on the organization chart. So they really have a skill at getting that compelling story and vision in front of people and building energy and excitement and creating a sense of community. It's a challenging skill, and that's one that can be learned. There are some hardwired traits that make it easier for some people than others, but it can be learned. Those are things that come to mind. Other questions? Yes, please.
Great. You had one of your charts where you're showing companies which are in agile, the ones which are moving scale. Have you tracked how they have actually performed after they actually moved to horizontal ways of working in terms of shareholder returns or ratings?
Yeah, and it's a complicated story, of course, because being able to isolate cause and effect in some of these interventions is a tricky thing to do. I go back to Nike because I've worked with those guys extensively. I know what they did. And when they made that shift from geo P&Ls and product, especially product-oriented P&Ls, to these global sport categories, it was a monstrous adjustment for them. But the growth in every single one of those categories in the third year of implementation was so significant. And so they had 5 years of that. And then when they set up a very horizontal retail capability, both for brick and mortar and what has become one of the most powerful e-commerce sites on earth, that became sort of the generator of that second wave. There's just no question that those changes have had a huge impact on Nike. I would say it's perhaps less evident in other companies. I think that Philips is definitely seeing some progress from this effort that it's made in the more recent past, the last 2 or 3 years, particularly around some of the markets that they have given a lot of responsibility and authority to create these solutions that include components that come from the center, but also things that they can generate locally. VF Corp with its North Face brand and its Napa Piri brand and its Timberland and Vans brand have had some very significant improvements in performance based on taking much more of a global view of brands, which is sort of the focus of the work that they're doing. A little less than product, really more about the brand story. There are examples out there, but it's difficult to say with certainty what any of these changes bring to specific results. You have to sort of look at it over the longer term. It's a great question. Others, we've got about 1.5 minutes left. Please. Yes. We're going to, let's use the microphone.
Are smaller, medium-sized, they're agile, they act in tribes, multidisciplinary teams, little hierarchy. So how do we make sure that we bring the best of both worlds together while we're creating our new growth model?
Boy, I'll tell you, I wish I knew the answer to that. That is such a fascinating topic. We're sort of using Red Hat and IBM as our poster child for that right now. We've worked with Red Hat, and the Red Hat people they don't want to accept anything with regard to this IBM relationship. And they can't. There, in fact, has to be a firewall because their clients are largely in the same business on the platform side, of course, that Big Blue is. So they have to walk this fine line between wanting to gain the benefits of scale by using the IBM reach into the market, but at the same time distance themselves from the parent so that they can be effective with their own customers. And it is a problem of having to create separation of the right things for the right period of time. We really love a book that was recently written where there is a framework in there that really speaks to the idea of how to separate around the incubation period and then recognize that there is this transformation or transition zone before we move those small businesses into the mainstream, where we begin to integrate structures, but we do not put our P&Ls on them, we do not put our return on asset measures on them, we may compensate them and measure them differently. That transition period then passes and we have to find a way to make them part of the mainstream. It's a really interesting framework, actually. But it's a hard puzzle, and it's one that really has to be considered, on a case-by-case basis. I think we have some frameworks to help the thinking, but it's a really difficult problem because we have to fight that battle of separation, but then at the right time, integration to gain the benefits that were part of the deal, right? All right, thank you. This was really, really fun. Look forward to working with you more over the course of the next day and a half. Wishing you the very best for these 2 days. Thanks.